cold wind slid softly against the window as the clock moved slowly toward midnight, and outside the sky was already trembling with impatient fireworks, each burst eager to announce the arrival of another new year. While inside a small, dimly lit room, a boy named Elias sat leaning over his desk, his shoulders heavy, his eyes fixed on a blank page that seemed to reflect everything he hadn't become yet, because every year ended the same way: a new calendar, a new beginning, and the same quiet hope that somehow this time things would finally change. He picked up his pen, inhaled deeply, and whispered to himself that this year would be different, that this year he would finally fix what felt broken inside him. And as the pen touched the paper, the words began to flow: waking up earlier, studying every day, exercising consistently, stopping procrastination, becoming confident, becoming disciplined, becoming the version of himself he carried silently in his imagination. And while his handwriting shook slightly, his heart felt steady, almost powerful, as if writing those goals alone was already transforming his life. For a brief moment, he believed it, believed that intention was enough, that desire could replace action, that this time would magically be different. But deep inside his chest, a quiet voice whispered a truth he didn't want to face, reminding him that he had written these same promises last year, and the year before that, and the year before that too. And before he could silence that thought, the clock struck midnight, fireworks exploded across the sky, painting the world with light and noise, while people everywhere celebrated new beginnings. Yet Elias felt the same familiar heaviness settle inside him. He closed the notebook, lay back on his bed, stared at the ceiling, and whispered that maybe this year would be different, though even as he said it, doubt wrapped tightly around his chest. The next morning, reality arrived without mercy when his alarm rang at 6 o'clock, and he opened one eye, glanced at the clock, turned his body away from the light, and fell back asleep. And by the time he woke up again, the morning was already gone, replaced by that familiar wave of shame that washed over him, heavy and bitter, as he thought about how the first day of the year had already ended in failure. He tried again the following day, and the next, but the cycle repeated itself endlessly: motivation filling his mind at night, promises made in the dark, dreams built in his imagination, only to collapse by morning, leaving disappointment waiting for him before noon. Weeks passed quietly, then another, the goals untouched, the notebook forgotten, and the version of himself he promised to become still painfully absent. Elias began avoiding mirrors because every time he caught his reflection, it felt as though it was speaking back to him, accusing him silently of being all words and no action. And he hated that voice, not because it was cruel, but because it felt true. One evening near the end of January, exhausted and frustrated, he found himself sitting at his desk again, book spread open, his notebook closed, his mind tired and heavy, while outside the winter rain tapped slowly against the window, as if trying to get his attention. He rested his hand on the table, breathed deeply, and whispered into the silence that he didn't understand why he couldn't change, why he kept failing himself, why effort always seemed to fade. And then something unexpected happened when he reached into an old drawer searching for a pen and noticed a small folded envelope tucked between two books, slightly yellowed by time. The ink faint, but his name written clearly on the front, from Elias to Elias, and confusion washed over him as he wondered when he could have written something like this, curiosity pulling him forward as he slowly opened the letter. Inside, written in familiar handwriting, were words that made his breath catch, telling him not to make new goals this year, but to build new habits instead, reminding him that the future doesn't change just because the calendar does, that life only changes when behavior changes, and that if he wanted a better version of himself, he needed to show up today, not tomorrow, not next year, but now, starting with one small habit, not chasing big goals, but building tiny actions that didn't feel impressive, yet were powerful enough to save him. Signed with a simple truth: trust me, I am you. Elias stared at the paper, reading the words again and again, recognizing the handwriting completely now, realizing these were his own thoughts, his own hope, written exactly 1 year earlier and then forgotten. And as the weight of that realization sank in, something inside him cracked open, because forgetting promises made to others is painful, but forgetting the promise you made to yourself cuts deeper than anything else. He whispered that he had told himself this before but hadn't listened, and as he stared at the wall in silence, something shifted inside him, not excitement, not motivation, but responsibility. That night, he didn't write a long list or make grand promises. He didn't plan a perfect future. He simply chose one small habit, waking up 10 minutes earlier. Not an hour, not a transformation, just 10 minutes, small enough to feel almost ridiculous, yet meaningful enough to try. The next morning, when the alarm rang, his body begged him to sleep. But he whispered that it was only 10 minutes. And for the first time in a long while, he got up, winning a small but real battle against himself. Some days he failed, some days he succeeded, but he didn't quit. He stopped chasing perfection and started chasing consistency. And over the weeks, something subtle but powerful began to change. His mornings felt clearer, his mind stronger, his guilt smaller, and his confidence slowly grew. With time, he added another tiny habit, 5 push-ups, then 10 minutes of reading, no pressure, no unrealistic expectations, just small wins stacking quietly day after day, until March arrived and he no longer felt lost. May arrived and people noticed something different about him. July arrived and he felt proud waking up. September arrived and his habits felt automatic, and by the time December returned, he was no longer the boy who failed his goals, but the boy who rebuilt himself one small habit at a time. When New Year's Eve came again and fireworks once more filled the sky, Elias sat quietly at his desk, opened his notebook, and instead of writing a list of goals, he wrote a single sentence thanking himself for trying again, then unfolded the old letter, read it slowly, and smiled, understanding at last that a new year doesn't give you a new life, decisions do. That change doesn't start on January 1st, but the moment you decide to stop reliving the same day over and over again. As he watched the fireworks outside, he whispered that this year he wasn't making promises. He was simply showing up, and as he folded the letter back into the drawer and wrote a new one for his future self, he finally felt something he never had before: peace. Because he understood that you don't need a new year to change your life. You just need one habit and a promise you actually keep. He remained still for a few moments after closing the drawer, letting the silence settle around him, feeling the room calmer than it had ever been before, as if the distant sound of fireworks had finally lost its power over him, because something far more important had aligned within. And as the night moved forward slowly, Elias stayed seated, watching his faint reflection in the window, realizing that for the first time he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. He wasn't carrying that old anxiety of needing to change everything at once, because now he understood that tomorrow didn't demand dramatic actions, it only asked for presence. The next morning, when the alarm sounded, there was no internal argument, no long negotiation with himself, just a simple, almost automatic movement, as if his body already knew what it was supposed to do. And as he stood up, Elias noticed something unfamiliar, not a rush of motivation or sudden excitement, but stability, a quiet sense of control over his own choices. And as he washed his face and looked at himself in the mirror, he didn't look away this time, because the reflection no longer felt like an accusation, but a reminder of someone who was finally trying. Days passed, then weeks, and the rhythm of his life slowly changed, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through repetition, through small actions repeated so often they began to feel natural. And even on days when he failed, when he overslept or skipped a habit, he didn't collapse into shame. He simply returned the next day, understanding that consistency was built not by perfection, but by persistence. His room began to look different, his desk less cluttered, his notebook no longer forgotten, his mornings calmer, his thoughts clearer, and with each passing week, the quiet confidence inside him grew stronger, not because life had become easier, but because he had become more reliable to himself. As the months continued to unfold, Elias realized that discipline wasn't something you forced, but something you earned by keeping small promises, and that self-respect didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated slowly, built on moments no one else saw, moments when he chose effort over comfort, when he showed up even when no one was watching. Spring passed without him noticing. Summer arrived and found him stronger, more focused, more grounded, and when autumn returned, he no longer measured time by failed resolutions, but by habits that had quietly shaped him into someone he trusted. One evening, long after the excitement of the new year had faded, Elias found himself opening the drawer again, not out of desperation, but out of reflection, holding the old letter in his hands and understanding that it hadn't changed his life by itself, but had reminded him of a truth he already knew, that change doesn't come from hope alone, it comes from action repeated daily. And as he folded the letter carefully and placed it back where it belonged, he felt a calm certainty settle in his chest, knowing that the person he was becoming was no longer a dream written on paper, but a reality being built quietly, one ordinary day at a time. As winter slowly faded into memory and the days began stretching longer, Elias started to notice how his internal world no longer depended on external motivation, because the habits he had built were no longer fueled by excitement but by identity, and each morning he woke up 10 minutes earlier. He wasn't proving discipline to the world. He was reinforcing a silent agreement with himself that his word mattered. Over time, those 10 minutes turned into space to think, to breathe, to sit in silence without distraction. And in that silence he began to understand how much of his past life had been lived on autopilot, reacting instead of choosing, escaping instead of facing, dreaming instead of building. There were still difficult mornings when his body felt heavy and his mind tried to pull him back into old patterns, whispering that one day didn't matter, that skipping once wouldn't change anything. But now Elias recognized that voice, not as truth, but as resistance, and instead of fighting it aggressively, he acknowledged it calmly and moved anyway, understanding that growth wasn't about silencing discomfort, but learning to walk with it without letting it decide his direction. As weeks turned into months, the small habits began connecting like invisible threads, forming a structure strong enough to hold him even on days when his confidence wavered, and he realized that discipline wasn't a personality trait you were born with, but a skill you practiced quietly until it became part of who you were. Reading 10 minutes a day slowly changed the way he thought, not by flooding his mind with knowledge, but by training his attention, teaching him how to stay present with one thing instead of scattering himself across distractions. And those 5 push-ups, which once felt meaningless, slowly transformed his relationship with effort, reminding him daily that strength was built through repetition, not intensity. There were moments when Elias looked back at his old notebooks, filled with abandoned goals and unfinished plans, and instead of feeling shame, he felt compassion, understanding that the version of himself who failed wasn't weak, just unaware, trapped in the illusion that massive change required massive action. And this realization softened something inside him, replacing self-judgment with responsibility, because now he knew better, and knowing better meant choosing differently. People around him began to sense the change before he spoke about it, noticing the calm in his presence, the steadiness in his voice, the way he no longer rushed to prove himself or explain his plans, because he was no longer trying to convince anyone, he was too busy becoming. Conversations felt different now, not because he had all the answers, but because he listened more, spoke less, and carried a grounded confidence that didn't demand attention. There were setbacks, moments when routines broke, days when stress piled up and habits slipped, but unlike before, these moments didn't spiral into abandonment, because Elias had learned the difference between failure and quitting, and as long as he returned, as long as he showed up again, nothing was truly lost. He stopped measuring progress by perfection and started measuring it by recovery, by how quickly he returned to his habits after falling, and this shift changed everything. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through his window, Elias found himself writing again. Not goals, not plans, but reflections, capturing thoughts about consistency, patience, and the quiet power of showing up daily. And as he read back his words, he realized that he had become the kind of person he once needed guidance from. Not because he had mastered life, but because he had mastered the habit of not giving up on himself. As autumn approached, Elias noticed how time felt different now, no longer rushing past him in a blur of wasted days, but unfolding steadily, each day carrying weight because it was lived intentionally. And this awareness brought a deep sense of gratitude, not for success, but for effort, for the simple fact that he was no longer asleep in his own life. Late one evening, sitting quietly in his room, Elias opened the drawer once more, holding the envelope he had written for his future self, feeling a calm certainty in his chest, not curiosity, not impatience, but trust, because he knew that regardless of what the next year brought, he would meet it the same way, one small habit, one intentional decision, one ordinary day at a time. And as the world outside continued chasing dramatic transformations and instant results, Elias understood something that most people never slow down enough to learn. That real change is quiet, almost invisible, built in moments that don't look impressive. Moments where no one is watching, moments where you choose yourself again and again. Not loudly, but consistently. He no longer waited for perfect conditions, for motivation, for the right mood, because he understood that life wasn't something you prepared for. It was something you practiced daily. And with every small habit he kept, he was practicing becoming someone reliable, someone grounded, someone who could be trusted with bigger responsibilities when they arrived. As another year slowly approached its end, Elias didn't feel the familiar fear or urgency that once consumed him, because he wasn't counting on the calendar to save him anymore. He was counting on himself, and that made all the difference. As the months continued to unfold, Elias found himself no longer counting days by deadlines or goals set on paper, but by moments of intentional presence, by the quiet victories that occurred in the stillness of his room, in the decisions made before sunrise, and in the conscious effort to return to small habits even when the day seemed too heavy or the world too demanding. And he began to notice a subtle transformation not in his accomplishments, but in his perception of himself. That voice, which once whispered doubt, no longer held power over him, because he had learned to recognize it as merely a shadow, an echo of past fear, and to move forward anyway. The routines he had built were not rigid chains but gentle scaffolds, holding him steady while allowing room for life's unpredictability. And as he continued to rise 10 minutes earlier each morning, to do his push-ups, to read and write quietly, he began to see patterns of thought shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated, noticing that decisions that once felt difficult now flowed more naturally, that patience and focus were becoming instincts, and that his mind, previously scattered, had begun to develop the clarity that comes from consistent attention over time. There were moments when Elias observed friends and peers rushing through life, chasing accolades, big results, and instant validation, and he realized that while the world celebrated the dramatic, he had discovered the extraordinary in the ordinary, the power in repetition, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived intentionally, moment by moment, without needing approval, without needing proof, only relying on his own commitment to himself. He also began to notice changes in how others interacted with him, not because he had become louder, more forceful, or more ambitious, but because the steadiness within him radiated outward, people unconsciously responding to a presence that was calm, dependable, and authentic. And this recognition did not inflate his ego, but reinforced a deep understanding that influence and respect are cultivated quietly, in the unseen work of self-discipline, patience, and reliability. One rainy afternoon, while watching the drops streak down the window pane, Elias reflected on how far he had come, remembering the nights spent in frustration, staring at blank pages, writing lists that never bore fruit, and he realized that the difference was not in the quantity of goals, but in the quality of commitment, that the small, almost invisible actions repeated without fail had reshaped the trajectory of his life, turning moments that once seemed meaningless into the foundation of his present and future self. In these months, Elias also began to experiment with intentional reflection, journaling not only tasks but emotions, patterns, and subtle realizations, and in doing so, he noticed how deeply intertwined habits were with identity, how small adjustments in behavior began to rewire self-perception, and how consistency fostered a trust in himself that no external reward could replicate, a trust so solid that it withstood failures, temptations, and lapses without shaking the core of his emerging character. The seasons changed outside the window, but inside Elias's room, time was measured differently now, not by months or holidays, but by the accumulation of small, deliberate actions, and the quiet rhythm of effort began to compose a life far more resilient and meaningful than any he had imagined in his previous, hurried attempts at transformation, because the secret he had discovered was that sustainable change is never dramatic. It is a series of gentle, repeated choices that slowly, imperceptibly, construct strength, clarity, and freedom. He began to understand that real power is never about appearance, recognition, or grand declarations, but about mastery over oneself, over impulses, over the quiet voice that demands immediate gratification. And as he continued to practice these small, deliberate habits, he found that even in moments of chaos, he could remain grounded, his mind calm, his actions deliberate, and this newfound internal stability allowed him to respond to life rather than react, to act with intention rather than urgency, and to see challenges as opportunities to reinforce the very routines that were shaping him from within. Elias also noticed that the way he experienced joy and satisfaction had transformed, that achievements no longer relied solely on external validation but on the quiet acknowledgement that he had kept his word to himself, that he had honored his own presence, and in doing so, he discovered a freedom that no external event could take away, a freedom rooted in self-reliance, patience, and the unshakable understanding that life's most profound transformations are always built from the inside out, invisible at first, yet undeniable over time. He began to look forward to mornings not as a test of willpower but as a sacred ritual: 10 minutes earlier to wake, 5 push-ups to remind his body of strength, 10 minutes of reading to expand his mind, moments of stillness to anchor his awareness, and even on days when energy flagged or distractions threatened, he returned to the practice, learning that persistence, not intensity, is the true measure of growth, and that the slow accumulation of small, consistent actions creates momentum, stronger than any fleeting surge of motivation could provide.